In the quiet suburbs of Salt Lake City, Karl Malone sat in his home office, surrounded by memorabilia from his legendary NBA career. The morning sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow on the countless trophies and photographs that lined the walls. But today, something different caught his attention, a weathered cardboard box that his wife had discovered while cleaning out their attic. As Karl opened the box, the musty scent of aged paper filled the air. Inside, among old newspaper clippings and forgotten letters, he found an envelope that made his heart skip a beat. The return address was from Amanda Roberts, dated 30 years ago when he was still playing for the Utah Jazz. The letter was written in careful penmanship, the kind that showed someone had taken their time to make every word count. As Karl unfolded the yellowed paper, he was transported back to a different time, when he was at the height of his career, known as the mailman for his consistent delivery on the court. "Dear Mr. Malone," the letter began, "my name is Amanda Roberts, and I'm writing to you from St. Mark's Hospital in Salt Lake City. I'm 12 years old, and the doctors say I have a serious condition that requires surgery. My dad and I watch every Jazz game together from my hospital room, and you're my hero." Karl's hands trembled slightly as he continued reading. Amanda had written about how watching him play gave her strength during her treatments, how his determination on the court inspired her to keep fighting. But what struck him most was her simple request at the end of the letter. "I know you're very busy, Mr. Malone, but if you could just send me a signed photo, it would mean the world to me." The realization hit him hard. This letter had somehow slipped through the cracks in the whirlwind of his career during a season when the Jazz were pushing for a championship. This one letter had been misplaced, never receiving the response it deserved. Karl sat back in his chair, memories flooding his mind. He remembered the thousands of letters he'd received over the years, the countless fans he'd met, but this one felt different. There was an innocence and honesty in Amanda's words that touched him deeply, even 3 decades later. Without hesitation, Karl turned to his computer and began searching. If Amanda Roberts was still out there, he was determined to find her. He owed her more than just a signed photo now. He owed her an apology and an explanation. The search led him through various social media platforms and public records. Hours passed as Karl dug deeper, following every possible lead. Finally, after numerous dead ends, he found a promising connection. An Amanda Roberts, who worked as a pediatric nurse at the very same hospital where she had been a patient all those years ago. Karl picked up his phone, his heart racing as he dialed the hospital's number. After several transfers and explanations, he finally heard a voice on the other end. "Hello, this is Amanda Roberts." The voice was warm and professional, carrying no hint of recognition for who might be calling. Karl took a deep breath. "Ms. Roberts, this is Karl Malone. I know this might sound strange, but did you write me a letter about 30 years ago when you were a patient at St. Mark's?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a quiet gasp. "Mr. Malone, yes, I did write that letter. I can't believe you're calling about it after all this time." Karl's voice filled with emotion as he explained finding the letter, his regret at never responding, and his desire to make things right. As he spoke, he could hear Amanda's breathing change, the professional demeanor giving way to the 12-year-old girl who had once poured her heart into that letter. "I never expected," Amanda's voice cracked slightly. "That was such a difficult time in my life, Mr. Malone. Watching you play, it gave me something to look forward to, something to believe in. The surgery was successful, and here I am, working with children who are going through the same things I did." Karl listened intently as Amanda shared her story, how she had not only survived, but thrived, choosing a career that allowed her to help others in their darkest moments. She spoke about using sports as motivation for her young patients, just as watching the jazz had motivated her. "I'd like to make it up to you," Karl said, his voice firm with determination. "Not just for missing your letter back then, but to hear your story, to see the amazing person you've become. Would you be willing to meet?" Amanda agreed, and they arranged to meet at the hospital where she worked. As Karl hung up the phone, he sat in silence for a moment, overwhelmed by the way life had brought this letter back to him at exactly the right time. He looked at the letter again, carefully folding it and placing it in his pocket. This wasn't just about making amends for a missed opportunity 30 years ago. It was about the impact we have on others, often without realizing it, and how acts of kindness, even those as simple as playing basketball with heart and determination, can inspire someone to keep fighting through their darkest days. As the sun began to set, Karl found himself looking through old photos from his playing days. He selected several special ones, including a few from the seasons when Amanda would have been watching from her hospital bed. He would bring these with him when they met, not just as memorabilia, but as physical reminders of the connection they had shared across time and circumstance. Tomorrow, he would meet Amanda Roberts, no longer the 12-year-old girl writing with hope from a hospital bed, but a strong, compassionate woman who had taken her own experiences and used them to help others. And maybe, just maybe, this delayed response to a 30-year-old letter would create something even more meaningful than if he had responded right away. The next morning, Karl Malone drove through the familiar streets of Salt Lake City, his heart beating a little faster than usual. In the passenger seat lay a carefully prepared package, the original letter, selected photographs from his playing days, and something special he had stayed up late working on. A handwritten letter to Amanda, expressing everything he wished. He could have said 30 years ago. The city had changed since his playing days, but St. Mark's Hospital still stood as a beacon of hope for countless families. As Karl pulled into the parking lot, he couldn't help but think about how many stories these walls held, including Amanda's. He grabbed the package and made his way to the entrance, where the automatic doors opened with a soft whoosh. The hospital lobby was busy with the morning rush, doctors hurrying to their rounds, visitors clutching coffee cups, and nurses changing shifts. Karl approached the information desk, where an elderly volunteer looked up and did a double take, recognition flooding her face. "Mr. Malone, what brings you here today?" she asked, her eyes lighting up with the kind of warmth that reminded him why Utah had always felt like home, even long after his playing days were over. "I'm here to meet Amanda Roberts," he replied, his voice carrying a mix of anticipation and nervousness that he hadn't felt since his rookie season. The volunteer made a quick call, and within minutes, Karl heard footsteps approaching from down the hall. Amanda Roberts walked with confidence, her scrubs neat and professional, but it was her smile that caught Karl's attention, warm and genuine, carrying echoes of the hopeful 12-year-old who had written to him so many years ago. She extended her hand, but Karl, always known for his personal touch, pulled her into a gentle hug instead. "Mr. Malone," she began, but he quickly interrupted. "Please call me Karl. After 30 years, I think we can skip the formalities," he said with a smile that put them both at ease. Amanda led him through the pediatric ward, and Karl couldn't help but notice how the children's faces lit up as they passed. Some recognized him, while others simply responded to his imposing yet gentle presence. They stopped at a small conference room where Amanda had arranged for them to talk privately. As they sat down, Karl pulled out the original letter, now protected in a clear sleeve. "I thought you might want to see this again," he said, carefully handing it to her. Amanda's hands trembled slightly as she took it, her eyes scanning the words she had written so long ago. "I remember writing this," she said softly, running her finger along the edge of the paper, I was so scared about the surgery, but watching you play gave me courage. You never gave up, no matter how tough the game got, and I told myself I had to be the same way." Karl listened intently as Amanda shared more about her journey, the successful surgery, the long recovery, and her decision to become a nurse. She spoke about the children she now cared for, how she used her own experience to help them find hope in their darkest moments. "Sometimes," she continued, "when a child is particularly frightened or discouraged, I tell them about watching the jazz play from my hospital bed. I tell them about writing to my hero and how, even though I never got a response, the act of reaching out, of believing in something bigger than my fear, helped me get through it." Karl felt a lump in his throat. "I brought something else for you," he said, reaching into his package. He pulled out the letter he had written the night before, along with a collection of photographs from the seasons when Amanda would have been watching. "I spent hours last night thinking about what I would have written back then if I had received your letter at the right time. But then I realized, maybe this is the right time. Because now I can tell you not just what your letter meant to me, but what your life's work means to so many others." Amanda opened the new letter, reading it silently as tears began to form in her eyes. Karl had written about his own struggles, his determination to succeed despite the odds, and how fans like her had given him strength when he needed it most. He wrote about the amazing person she had become, how her work with children carried forward the spirit of hope and resilience that she had found in watching basketball all those years ago. As she finished reading, Amanda wiped her eyes and looked up at Karl. "You know, for years, I wondered if you ever got that letter, but now I understand that sometimes things happen in their own time, for their own reasons. If you had responded back then, it would have meant the world to that scared little girl. But meeting you now, sharing this moment, it means even more to the woman I've become." Karl nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They spent the next hour sharing stories, Karl talking about his playing days, the pressure of being the mailman, and Amanda sharing tales of the countless children she had helped through their own battles. As their conversation drew to a close, Amanda hesitated for a moment before asking, "Would you like to meet some of the children? There are quite a few who could use a dose of hope right now." Karl's face lit up. "I'd be honored," he said, standing up. "But first, I have one more thing for you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a custom-made pendant in the shape of a mailbox with the inscription "Hope Delivered" on the back. "Because sometimes," he said with a smile, "the mail might be delayed, but it always gets there in the end." Amanda clasped the pendant with tears in her eyes, and together they walked out to meet the children, both knowing that this delayed delivery had created something far more meaningful than either could have imagined 30 years ago. Walking through the pediatric ward with Amanda, Karl noticed how the atmosphere changed with each step they took. Children who had been listless in their beds suddenly perked up, their eyes widening at the sight of the 6'9" former NBA star. But what touched him most was watching Amanda interact with each child. She knew all their names, their stories, their fears, and their small victories. They stopped first at the room of a young boy named Marcus Hammond, who was sitting up in bed with a basketball clutched in his hands. His face lit up when he saw Amanda, but his jaw dropped when he recognized Karl. "Marcus," Amanda said softly, "remember how I told you about watching basketball when I was a patient here? This is Karl Malone, the player I used to watch. He found my letter after all these years." The boy's eyes grew even wider. "The mailman," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Karl stepped forward, gently taking the basketball from Marcus's hands. "That's right, young man, and I hear you're fighting, just as hard as I ever did on the court." Karl spun the basketball on his finger, drawing a delighted laugh from Marcus. "Mind if I sign this for you?" As Karl signed the ball, Amanda explained that Marcus was preparing for his third round of chemotherapy. Like her all those years ago, he found strength in watching basketball, studying game highlights during his treatments. Throughout the morning, they visited more children. Each room held a different story, a different battle, but the same undying spirit that Karl had seen. In Amanda's letter 3 decades ago, he shared stories from his playing days, but more importantly, he listened to their stories, their dreams, their fears, and their determination to keep fighting. In one room, they met Sarah Douglas, a teenage girl who had been in the hospital for months following a severe car accident. She was an aspiring writer, and when she heard about Amanda's letter and Karl's delayed response, she immediately saw the poetry in it. "It's like a message in a bottle," Sarah said thoughtfully. "But instead of crossing oceans, it crossed time. And maybe it arrived exactly when it was supposed to." Karl nodded, touched by her insight. "You know, Sarah, sometimes the best plays aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones that develop naturally, when everyone is in exactly the right place at the right time." As they continued their rounds, Karl noticed something remarkable happening. The story of Amanda's letter was spreading through the ward, passed from room to room like a whisper of hope. Parents and nurses stopped them in the hallways, asking to hear the story again and again. In the cancer ward, they met a nurse named Jennifer Mason, who had worked with Amanda for years. "I always wondered where Amanda got her special touch with the kids," Jennifer said. "Now I understand. She's been where they are, and she never forgot what it felt like to find hope in unexpected places." Karl watched as Amanda shared her story. With a group of young patients gathered in the ward's common room, she held up the pendant he had given her, explaining how sometimes the best answers come when we least expect them, and how hope has a way of finding us even in our darkest moments. As the morning wore on, Karl found himself deeply moved by the impact one small letter had created. It wasn't just about his delayed response or making amends. It was about how a single act of reaching out, whether it was a 12-year-old girl writing to her hero or a nurse sharing her story with her, impatience could create ripples of hope that extended far beyond its original intention. During a quiet moment between visits, Amanda turned to Karl. "You know, I've been thinking about all the letters you must have received over your career. How many other stories are out there waiting to be told?" Karl paused, considering her words. "I saved every letter I ever received," he said slowly. "They're in boxes in my attic, thousands of them. Finding yours, it made me wonder about all the others." Amanda's eyes lit up with an idea. What if this isn't the end of the story? What if it's just the beginning? She explained her vision, creating a program at the hospital where current patients could connect with former patients who had fought similar battles. Just as her story had inspired hope in the children they'd met today, other stories could do the same. "The mailman delivering hope," she said with a smile. "What do you think?" Karl felt a familiar surge of excitement, the same feeling he used to get before a big game. "I think it's perfect, and I know exactly where to start. Those boxes in my attic, each letter is a story, a connection waiting to be made." As they discussed the possibilities, they were interrupted by a small voice. "Ms. Roberts?" A young girl named Emma Williamson stood in the doorway, clutching a piece of paper. "I wrote a letter too, not from 30 years ago, but from today." Amanda knelt down to take the letter, reading it aloud. "Dear future me, today I met someone who showed me that hope doesn't have an expiration date. Sometimes it takes a while to arrive, but when it does, it's even more special." Karl and Amanda exchanged glances, both recognizing that their delayed connection had sparked something much bigger than themselves. The story of a 30-year-old letter had become a catalyst for new stories, new connections, and new hope. As the day continued, Karl realized that sometimes the most powerful assists aren't made on the basketball court. Sometimes they're made in hospital hallways, in shared stories, and in letters that take the long way home. 1 month after his visit to St. Mark's Hospital, Karl Malone stood in his attic, surrounded by dozens of opened boxes. Letters spilled out onto the floor, thousands of them, each containing a story, a hope, a connection waiting to be rekindled. He had spent weeks sorting through them, working with Amanda Roberts to create something neither of them had imagined possible when they first reconnected. The Mailman's Hope Project had grown from a simple idea into a full-fledged program at St. Mark's Hospital. Each week, Karl and Amanda would select letters from his collection, trying to locate the writers and connect them with current patients facing similar challenges. The response had been overwhelming. Today was special. They had organized a gathering at the hospital where some of the original letter writers would meet the current patients they had been paired with. Karl adjusted his tie, picked up the box of carefully selected letters, and headed to his car. When he arrived at St. Mark's, the conference room had been transformed. Photos from his playing days adorned the walls, but they weren't just action shots from games. They were pictures of him reading letters, meeting fans, visiting hospitals. Amanda had created a timeline, starting with her original letter from 30 years ago and continuing through to the present day. People began arriving, former patients, now adults with their own stories of survival and success, current patients, eager to meet those who had walked their path before, and medical staff who had witnessed countless battles won and lost within these walls. Among them was Marcus Hammond, the young basketball fan they'd met during Karl's first visit. He was having a good day, his mother said, his first in weeks. He clutched his signed basketball, telling anyone who would listen about how the mailman himself had given it to him. Sarah Douglas, the teenage writer, had brought something special. She had written a poem about delayed deliveries and perfect timing, about hope that arrives exactly when it's needed most. She would read it later, her words giving voice to what so many in the room felt but couldn't express. As Karl stood to address the gathering, he felt a familiar pre-game butterfly sensation in his stomach. But this wasn't about scoring points or winning championships. It was about something far more valuable. 30 years ago, he began, a young girl wrote me a letter. Like thousands of others, it was sent with hope and expectation. Unlike the others, it sat unopened for 3 decades. But what seemed like a failure of delivery turned out to be perfect timing. He gestured to Amanda, who stood proud in her nurse's uniform, the hope delivered pendant gleaming at her throat. That girl grew up to deliver hope every day in these very halls, and when we finally connected, it wasn't just about making up for lost time. It was about creating new possibilities. One by one, the original letter writers shared their stories. There was Robert Wilson, who had written to Karl in 1997 while battling leukemia. Now a healthy adult, he had been paired with a current patient fighting the same disease. Crystal Davis, who had written about losing her father and finding comfort in watching basketball with her brothers, now counseled grieving families. The current patients listened intently, seeing living proof that their struggles could lead to triumph, that their darkest days could give way to light. They shared their own stories too, of fears faced, of small victories won, of hope maintained, despite overwhelming odds. As the afternoon progressed, something magical happened. The line between past and present began to blur. Letters were exchanged, promises made to stay in touch, connections forged that went beyond shared medical histories to touch something deeper. The universal human experience of facing adversity with courage. Amanda took the podium near the end of the gathering. When I wrote my letter all those years ago, I thought I was reaching out to a basketball star. What I was really doing was reaching out to my future self, to all of you, to the endless possibility that hope creates. She unveiled a new initiative, a letter-writing program where current patients could write to their future selves, to be delivered when they had overcome their challenges. The first letters would be stored in a special mailbox, designed to look like the pendant Karl had given her, installed in the pediatric ward. Karl watched as patients, both past and present, lined up to write their letters. Some wrote quickly, others took their time, all of them understanding that they were part of something bigger than themselves. As the event drew to a close, Karl found himself back in Marcus's room. The boy was tired but happy, clutching both his signed basketball and the letter he had written to his future self. "Mr. Malone," Marcus said sleepily, "do you think my letter will take 30 years to arrive too?" Karl smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "No, Marcus, your letter will arrive exactly when it needs to. That's the thing about hope. It always finds its way home." Later that evening, as Karl drove home, he thought about all the letters still waiting in his attic. Each one represented a story unfinished, a connection yet to be made. But now he understood. Sometimes the best plays take time to develop, and the most important assists are the ones that keep giving long after the game is over. The mailman had found a new route, delivering something more precious than points or championships. He was delivering hope, one letter at a time, proving that it's never too late for a message to reach its intended destination. And somewhere in St. Mark's Hospital, in a special mailbox shaped like a pendant, new letters waited to begin there. On journeys through time, carrying with them the promise that hope, like the best stories, knows no expiration date.